It's great to be here, and it's lovely to see some familiar faces and also some new people, many of whose work I'm looking forward to finding out more about, particularly the special issue that Michelle has just discussed. I'm just going to share my screen and then we can get going. Everybody see that okay? Yeah? Okay, so let's just start. What I want to say really in terms of what I'm doing today is really I'm sharing and thinking in public. So this is me sharing a draft paper that I'm working on. I've spent the last 20 odd years working in the field of educational futures, thinking about how we think about the future in education. And I've become increasingly convinced that actually thinking only through that temporal lens is particularly unhelpful. So you then start thinking about, well, how do we use pasts to frame our conception of education? How to use presents? So what that work has led me to is really this point, which is this focus on what I'm calling the temporal imagination. And a few years working with time and climate change has really surfaced this as a critical issue for me, not just for education, but for how we think about and how we approach the question of climate change. So just to give a summary for those of you who like knowing what you're going to get in advance, and also in case any of you have to leave early, this is what I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue that how we think about time and how we use it to coordinate ourselves and others matters to us as individuals. So time is not just a neutral backdrop and a container for our lives, but it's something that we co-produce and that shapes our perception of reality. I want to suggest that nowhere is this more important than in the area of climate change. When we think about climate change, the way in which we think about, use and manipulate time is absolutely critical. When we think about the disconnect between the timings of political cycles and the timings, for example, of ocean acidification, toxification of water, accretion of carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere, the question of which time frames we use becomes absolutely critical, and which rhythms of life are we trying to sustain. I want to suggest on the basis of this that because of these temporal challenges, particularly in relation to climate change, but you can also think about it in relation to a whole host of other issues, we need what I'm calling, after Mills and Harvey, a temporal imagination. And I want to suggest that that imagination can be understood as the capacity to provincialize naturalized conceptions of time, to reflect upon the multiple temporal frames and coordination devices that are being used in any situation, and to engage in dialogue with others who use different frames. And so what I want to do in this talk is to explore the rationale for this proposition. And more importantly, as an educator, I'm interested in what are the emerging practices that might help us to cultivate such an imagination, whether in formal or informal education. So to start off with, time is not just a container for our lives. If you look at this clock, this is a clock in my hometown in Bristol, and it has 3 hands. And the black hand is not the second hand. The black hand is a second minute hand. So what it does is it's a clock that tells us the time in 2 forms of measurement. And it tells us the time for both London time and Bristol time. And it was introduced at the point at which Greenwich Mean Time, London time, was introduced to Bristol, and people had to start coordinating with London time, both in terms of doing deals, arranging things in the marketplace, but mainly in terms of catching the train to London, which was running on London time. And I share that with us simply to show, very simply, that the time measures we use are a product of people, of technologies, of political decisions. The 3-handed clock reminds us that any measurement of time is always selected from many different possibilities, some of which may be in conflict. And so when we think of time, we think of it not just as a universal constant that sits outside of us, that is a neutral container, but as a situated marker of the relationship between different forms of change, the choice that we make about which, in the case of the clock, which point in the sky, when are we going to choose the sun is at its highest, okay? So we are making choices constantly. And we're making choices that are selections from a variety of possibilities when we're deciding how to tell the time. And the choices that we're making have real effects. And I want to talk about those effects, not only in relation to children's lives when we're thinking about school, or adults' lives when we think about adult education, but also in relation to how we think about and approach the question of climate change. So, and I know some of you in this group are very familiar with these things, but I'm aware that there are others for whom this question of time and its socially constructed nature, well, socially and biophysically constructed nature, is worth signalling. So, for example, if we want to, how do we choose the timing of how we organize our lives, how we organize our relationships with each other, when we meet, when we connect? Let's think about what would an institution that was organized around bodily hunger look like in terms of how it organized its practices, or around clocks, or around tasks. And what happens when we choose these different things as measures of when we should do something? I think in Michelle's terms, he would call these rhythms. This then creates a set of patterns and a set of relationships that become naturalized, and we then take them for granted. And this is where the issues of power start coming in. So we take for granted that we're going to use certain measures. So, for example, we choose to use the sun rather than the moon to coordinate our farming activities, our day-to-day activities. This is not natural, this is a choice. And if we look at Maori conceptions of time, they will often work with moon cycles rather than sun cycles. In relation to climate change, we have decided to use, although this is clearly still contested, otherwise we'd be doing something about it, we have decided to use parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere effectively as a clock to tell us when we should change how our industries work, or our transport systems, or our social lives. So we hear the phrase, we've got 10 years to save the planet. That's the use of carbon dioxide parts per million in the atmosphere as a clock. And one of the things that we might ask ourselves is, why have we used that as a clock rather than hunger or inequality as measures? So, we could use the prevalence of bodily hunger as a clock for saying, hang on, we should do things differently. We also, for example, have naturalized accounting mechanisms that privilege the present rather than future generations. These are clocks and practices that determine how we make value. And so these measurements that we choose to use become naturalized. They become taken for granted. This is how the world works. And what's important about them is that they also alienate those whose rhythms of life don't or can't fit within them. People who, need to work on a different rhythm. And that we see this as socially stratified. Quite often those with power set the calendar and the clock. And if we look at any of the amazing ethnographic work done by people like Sarah Sharma or Lisa Baritza, we can see the different rhythms that people might occupy in their lives, and the ways in which these are brought into conflict or contrast with, if you like, dominant clock times. So time matters because the way in which we choose to measure it creates naturalized timescapes that make some things more or less conceivable. But the stories that we tell of time also influence how we interpret and understand the world. And this is where I was trained as a literature scholar. I've done a huge amount of work on discourse. So the way in which our stories and narratives shape our reality. And the stories of time that we tell are also absolutely critical in framing. And this is where I go off in a different direction from, say, Michelle's work and Fadia's work on rhythm. So let's start with a question for a second. What shape is time? What shape do you see time taking? Just take a moment and hold that in your head. We have inherited assumptions about the shape that time takes. Some of you might have seen a cycle, a circle. Some of you may have seen a wave, others a spiral, others an arrow. These conceptions of the shape of time underpin a whole set of political narratives and naturalize political narratives. So if we think about something like the very familiar American Trumpist, Make America Great Again phase. This is a cyclical narrative that naturalizes the idea that time will go back to a previous existence, that you can shift things around and you go back to a previous existence. We used the same concept in the Brexit debate in the UK. The phrase was take back control. That word back implied the possibility of reversing time, going back to, in a cycle, to the world that we lived in. You'll then hear phrases, after the pandemic, for example, in education, we'll all be familiar with phrases like, we have to make up for the learning that was lost. We have to get back on track, as though there is a singular directionality to learning, as though there is one pathway against which we will judge children. And then we've got phrases like, we have 10 years to save the planet. So at that point, you've got this concept of time ending, that there's a story of time that finishes. So all of those stories or frames of time structure our sense of, again, politically natural modes of action. It becomes natural to take back control. It becomes natural to think that we've got 10 years to save the planet. But one of the things that's becoming clear is that these stories of time also structure social cleavages. People have different shapes of time in mind when they work with each other. And probably the clearest example of this is Kyle White's brilliant paper, which is actually called something different, but the phrase that he uses is the apocalypse has already happened. So he talks here about the perspective of indigenous communities and of colonized communities, looking at climate change narratives that are apocalyptic, that are telling a story of a future that is to come. And he argues, actually, this is a future that has already happened to us. So from our time perspective, the apocalypse is in the past. We have already lost our civilization, our society, our way of being in the world. This has already been destroyed. And so you can see how we get the potential for serious conflict and misunderstanding and misalignment, miscommunication when we're operating with these different time frames. If you've got a whole bunch of people sitting in the West going net zero by 2050, we don't solve everything by 2030, that's a very different perspective. Otherwise the apocalypse is going to come. It's a very different temporal frame from those who are saying, look, it's already happened. These are different starting points. So can we make these visible? And then the third reason that I think that time matters as something that we need to pay attention to is quite simply the reality that time is what we live in. We've been worrying about what it means to live in time, and particularly finite time, for a very, very long time. There's a brilliant phrase, fabulous book by Ruth Ozeki called Tale for the Time Being. And this foregrounds the idea of humans as time beings. What does it mean to be alive? It means that we live in time. And that to me is a really generative phrase. What would education for time beings look like? The lovely thing about that is we also get to lose the phrase human beings. We are time beings alongside other time beings. We coexist. There's many, many different time beings, and we have different speeds and paces and rhythms of time. And answering this question, what does it mean to live in time, always brings up this poem for me, Philip Larkin's poem, Days. What are days for? Days are where we live. They come, they wake us time and time over. There to be happy, and where can we live but days? Solving that question brings a priest and the doctor in their long coats running over the fields. It's not just the priest, it's not just the doctor, it's all of us. What does it mean? Where can we live but days? So this question of how we live in time, understanding how to live in time, if there is nothing else for me that in education we should be working in, is answering and exploring, frankly, that question that isn't answerable. So I want to suggest that we need what we might call a temporal imagination. And this is a phrase that Barbara Adam in her book Timescapes of Modernity makes reference to. She uses the phrase temporal imagination to talk about how we imagine time. But I want to collide it with Harvey's concept of the geographical imagination and Mills' concept of the sociological imagination. And what both of them are pointing to around space and society is the ability to provincialize your own assumptions. So to become aware that your own naturalized ways of thinking about something are specific, they are not universal, and they could be put into dialogue with others. And so what I want to suggest is that a temporal imagination might be understood It's the capacity to provincialize our naturalized conceptions of time, so to unsettle them, to reflect critically upon the use of temporal frames and coordination devices in any setting. So to think about what is going on, how is time being used and how is it being deployed here? And then the third point is to then engage in dialogue with others who use different time frames. And this is where, particularly for questions of climate change and sustainability, this becomes particularly important. So how do we have a conversation with people who think the apocalypse has already happened or who think the apocalypse is about to come? How do we have a conversation with those whose immediate time pressures are that the water is rising, and those who are trying to figure out how do we shift an entire industrial civilizational complex and the speeds at which that should happen? So this is the point for me really around thinking about temporal imagination. It's not just an individual issue, it's one that is allowing us to talk and speak with other people differently, because our different temporal frames underpin many of our disconnects with each other. But possibly this might be not strong enough, it might not be critical enough. There is a risk that we simply say we need to be reflexive, we need to pluralize, and actually we may also need to sort of strengthen this definition of temporal imagination to think about challenging the misuses of time as power. And there's such a long history of this happening over hundreds of years. There's a brilliant book, I think it's called 12 Clocks That Changed the World, or something similar like that, that goes back to the way in which time and power has been misused for many years. So that to me is an educational question. I mean, it would be, I'm in an education field. However, for me, it's a fundamentally educational question. How do we nurture this temporal imagination? So one of the places that I started was to go back and to look at how schools teach time. And I've done a bunch of work over the last year and a half with teachers, talking with them about how they see time as an object of kind of intellectual inquiry. So here I'm not talking about how the kind of timings of school. I'm interested in where time manifests itself within the curriculum. And it's a fascinating conversation that I encourage you to have with as many teachers as possible. And it comes up very fleetingly in a whole range of different places. So, for example, any language teachers are teaching grammar, they're teaching tense, past perfect, future present, all of the, it's embedded. Quite often we don't learn it in our native language. We have to learn another language in order to see it, which for me makes visible actually one of the really useful reasons for learning another language. We see it coming up in literature, for example, in rhythm, obviously in music, in rhythm, and also foreshadowing. We see it coming up in science and mathematics in different measurement mechanisms. So how do you measure time is a common question in different disciplines. And also the physicists, the big debate between Bergson and Einstein, Einstein won that debate because in schools, there is no philosophical inquiry into the nature of time. It's almost entirely colonized by the physics department, who are still teaching Newtonian physics. Very, very rarely do you get anything beyond Newtonian physics in terms of time taught in schools. So there's not a lot, and importantly, it's often hugely fragmented and it's dominated by questions of chronology. So again, it also, if we look in the literature around how we teach time, quite often there is an obsession with whether we can teach kids the right order of things, how to locate everything in linear time. And there was actually a brilliant survey of time in education done in about, I think, 2017. And it was a really fascinating study of the literature. But what was interesting to me was by the end of it, the conclusion they got to was that our relationship with time is changing because of new technologies. This is disrupting kids' conceptions of time. And therefore, we need to teach kids linear time so that they can inhabit professional settings. That was the conclusion that they got to. And I thought that was entirely the wrong conclusion of having read all of that literature. But anyway, separate conversation. So that was a conversation about time in the curriculum. But when we talked to the teachers, actually it became clear we were teaching time. We were teaching time all the time in schools. We asked teachers how they frame or understand time, and they said They talk about it in time in schools as insufficient, it's intense, it's frantic, it's rushed, it's rigid, it's controlled, it's pressured, it's finite, it's measured, it's relative, it's crushed, it's stretched and stressed. This is an exhausting set of words. This is how we're teaching time in schools. Teachers saw time as something to be lost or managed or planned. So this is the classic time thrift, E.P. Thompson framing. This is time as a machine. And one teacher framed it for me really beautifully. She said, we're teaching the threat of time. She said, all of our sanctions in schools are associated with time. You can have it, you can lose time, you can have it taken away, you can get told that the future, certain things will happen, and if you don't do the right thing, bad things will happen. So this for me is a real problem. If we think about time as being so critical, if we think about time as being what we live in, if we think that we are time beings, that we're effectively teaching time as chronology and we're teaching time as threat. This gives us very little to work on as a set of resources for dealing with the generative, very beautiful, complex nature of what it means to live in time. So my conclusion, my hunch from all of this is that actually, if we want to think about educating the temporal imagination, we're unlikely to find it in mainstream educational structures and practices. We're going to need to look somewhere else. So this is where I've started being interested. I'm interested in saying, where else might we look? Where else might we find this? And what I'm going to talk about now is a very loose clustering of pedagogic practices that I have become interested in, that for me start to offer individually, but more importantly together, the set of what we might see as a repertoire for educating temporal imagination. This is not comprehensive, this is not a rigid typology, and really I'm presenting it here as a basis for us to have a conversation around. So what I'm suggesting is that we can see different, what I would call temporal pedagogies, found in a whole range of different settings. So we can find them in social arts setting, adult education, indigenous and land-based education. We can see it in marginalized educational practices, particularly in educational philosophy. We can see it in public pedagogy. We're starting to see things in climate activism, management and government. And we can see a whole load of people, artists, professional facilitators, often educators and activists who are trying to work out how we create conditions. And here it's often driven by a real world issue where the temporal frames are not working. How do we create conditions for people to examine and reflect upon how they think about time as a resource for making sense of the world? And I want to suggest that there's this kind of loose clustering of practices. The first of them is anticipatory, which is oriented towards futures. A second is what I call pedagogies of temporal suspension, which is about trying to, if you like, stop time. The third is what I call pedagogies of relational time, which is attention to deep time, ongoing relationships, particularly with land and other beings. The fourth, familiar to this group, I think, would be rhythmic pedagogies oriented towards surfacing and working with individual and collective rhythms of time. And the fifth, I would call temporal reflexivity, which is coming out of critical time studies. And I know there's people in this group who've been working in this area for a long time. So just to talk these through. So the cluster of pedagogies that I want to surface here would be those that have origins in future studies since the 1940s. So the field of future studies emerged after the Second World War, led by people like Hannah Arendt and Hans Jonas, amongst others, who were confronting the question, how do we live in a world where the scientific and technological developments that we've created produce impacts way, way, way beyond the human lifespan? So they were focusing in here particularly on questions of how do we deal with the fallout of nuclear radiation. So out of that work came a whole set of questions about how do we support people to reflect on ideas of the future. And from this you get things like the sociology of the future and Wendell Bell. This has manifested itself in education in traditions like futures education that have been at the margins of environmental education and peace studies in the 1980s and 1990s, and we'd see people like David Hicks, Richard Slaughter, Hedley Beer, Ivana Milosevic. And then more recently, we've got this concept of futures literacy or literacies that is really gaining momentum, so being driven mainly by UNESCO. And what this work tries to do is to allow people to start asking questions about the assumptions of the future that they're working with. So firstly, it would say, when you say the future, do you mean the future or multiple futures? It would ask, which timescale are we thinking of? Are we thinking about next year? Or are we thinking about tomorrow? Are we thinking about 100, 1,000, a millennium? So those are the sorts of questions they start asking. And then they start saying, you know, how are futures made? What are our conceptions about how this thing, the future, is produced? It's had mixed success. What we have seen is that this work has really been picked up in corporate and government sectors for better or worse. So really led, interestingly, by the oil industry. So Shell has been one of the big drivers of these sorts of futures pedagogies. And the familiar ones you see in that sort of space are things like scenarios, scenario planning, imagining with alternative futures and trying to figure out how to do well, irrespective of any of them. And the work here that is worth really looking at is Jenny Anderson's work, brilliant book called The Future of the World, where she's looked at the way in which these pedagogies were introduced in corporate and government settings and the way in which they were used in the end to set geopolitical relationships in the Middle East and to create divisions between different actors in the Middle East. So against that corporate tradition, we've got the rise of critical traditions of futures thinking. Here we'd look at utopian action research, we'd look at participatory futures work, we'd look at the growing fields of social movements are increasingly picking this sort of stuff up, because one of the things that anticipatory pedagogies do is they invite us to think about the emotional and affective consequences of imagining and thinking about futures. And alongside that, we've got the growth in the last 10 or so years. Well, actually, Afrofuturism is clearly nearly 50 years old now. If you think about Sunrise, think about Octavia Butler, which is work that is about challenging the absence of people of colour and Indigenous people in futures and thinking about how you mobilise past as resources for imagining and creating alternatives. That particular field, those sorts of pedagogies are so creative with how they use time, how they choose when to draw on an image from the future and an image from the past, when to locate oneself within the stream of time and when to stand outside of it. So anticipatory pedagogies is one area that we can look at for this question of educating the temporal imagination. The second is a cluster of people who I'm not sure will remotely agree to being clustered together in the same group, but I'm clustering them together for now, just because otherwise you end up just talking about everybody separately. And this is the pedagogy of temporal suspension, which is about inviting people to interrupt the flow of time, to think not about our location in time as, if you like, lost, the infinitesimal now, but to open up the now and to say that this is a time of what could be understood as the thick present. And here, the concept of the thick present is something where we might draw on both Roberto Poli's work, but also Donna Haraway. There's a whole load of people starting to talk about thickening and deepening the present as a site of action. One of the phrases I use a lot is the richness of the meanwhile, that sense of the meanwhile, what is going on at present, being abundant and diverse, rather than a kind of thin sliver of time trapped between two others. And we've got a whole set of different intellectual traditions that are driving this framing. So here you've got the European critical educational philosophy tradition, Geert Biester, Jan Maschelein, who are drawing on conceptions precisely of schooling here as time out. So they draw on school as skole, a concept of leisure, the framing of a time out of time. You can also see people, Sharon Todd's new book that's coming out this year, draws on Buddhist traditions to redefine the present moment as precisely a moment of unfolding. And most of these writers are trying, Deborah Osberg made the same argument in about 2016. Most of these writers are trying to say we think about education, the educational moment, as a motion of suspension of time, a motion of deepening into the richness of the present, and a motion of, in Deborah Osberg's terms, she calls it symbiotic anticipation, the idea of different existences coming together to be able to create something new. And I'd just advise you to have a look at Sharon Todd's work there. I won't read that whole quotation. The third conception of time, the third set of pedagogies of time that I'm really drawn to at the moment are pedagogies that are built on a kind of relational ontology. So a conception of time, not, if you like, as universal, standardized, but as something that is deeply relational, can only be produced in the moment. And here we can draw on, and we can learn from, although we need to do a lot of unlearning ourselves before we do so, the pedagogic traditions that are being picked up from and learnt from indigenous knowledge traditions. Here, time is understood as the deep time of relationship with land and with ancestors. There's a really fantastic group working in Australia called the Bawaka Country Collective. It's a collective of Datui elders, community members, and academic geographers, and they are trying to make the case that in the long new world, time is not abstract, it's not empty, it doesn't exist separately from more than human worlds. And you get a different framing here. This concept of relational time is carried across generations in Quechua pedagogies, where the future is not empty territory to be predicted, mapped, and conquered, but is better understood as a story told between the people of the past and the people of the present and everyone and everything around. So these sorts of pedagogies are inviting us to think about storytelling, about intergenerational storytelling, and about relationship with the more than human others with whom we coexist. The fourth set of pedagogies that I draw attention to are the pedagogies of rhythm. And here, I mean, I feel crazy talking about this one. Michelle's in the room. So, you know, if you've got any questions about this, please ask him and Fabia. So here we've got the concept of rhythmic intelligence, this attention to the rhythms of life and to that patterning of rhythm and disruption as a kind of, as a moment of emancipation. The practice that I'm more familiar with here is also those that in the environment field are trying to help us deal with that big existential question about time that I talked about earlier, which is about the possibility of the ending of time and how we deal with the emotional and affective issues around that. So I'm thinking here, for example, about Joanna Macy's grief work, which allows us to confront what has been lost. I'm thinking about the arts practices such as the extinction gong or the Day of Remembrance for Lost Species. All of these help us to sit with that attention to what it means for time to end, the finiteness of time. But I'm also really interested in the pedagogies of transitions and thresholds that seek to create intentional ruptures in our rhythms to allow us to pay attention to those moments of transition and to think about what it means to shift between different points in life. And here I'm thinking about practices like wilderness quests and rituals that allow people to say, what does it mean to move into adulthood? What does it mean to move into elderhood? How do we mark those moments? And what I draw from that sort of work is a critical importance of ritual as a practice for holding our attention to time and to temporality. And one of my questions is, do we need to start thinking about the development of new rituals to allow us to build and embody and develop different held relationships with time? And what might those be? I also indicate here that practice theory exists. One of the things when I share this thought with people in sociology who are very familiar with practice theory is they go, yeah, but what about practice theory? And I say, yes, it exists. What we haven't seen is its manifestation in pedagogy, I don't think. I think we've got a lot of descriptions of the habituated nature of social practices. What I'm less familiar with, if it exists, I'd love to hear about it, is that translation into pedagogic practice. So, and then the final sort of category or cluster temporal pedagogies that I want to draw attention to is the work that's coming out of critical time studies. And I know Dawn in this group is doing some really fascinating work here and has been for a long time. We have a special issue coming out in Time and Society shortly on this. And what this is doing is pulling all of the literature on how do we teach critical time studies, so that the awareness of time as mechanical, technological, political, socially constructed. How do we teach the way in which we might do that? And so there's a whole set of people working in that discipline across universities who are developing some really fascinating pedagogies, quite often things like getting people to make their own clocks, make a clock, make a water clock. What happens? What choices are you making in those processes? One of the great people writing about this and demonstrating some fantastic work on this is Kevin Berth, who's a historian of time. This sort of work, Kevin, for example, talks about the way he teaches his students by getting them to turn in their work according to different calendars. So, for example, according to the Gregorian calendar, according to the movement of the sun or the moon, according to their body calendar, and just simply by that move, making it visible the extent to which we're making choices all the time about which calendars we're using and how. And what Kevin and others are doing is really the critical thing here is drawing attention to the conflicts between different ways of measuring change and progress and the ways in which these are negotiated. So those are some of the different modes of thinking about and reflecting on different aspects of time that when we look around us become visible. There are clearly many others. I mean, we can think of Olafur Eliasson's work for the Paris Climate Summit, where he, shifted a load of icebergs or parts of icebergs and put them outside the Paris Convention Center. And that is a critical temporal pedagogy that he's using there, because he's inviting you to notice, to hear the sounds of air trapped in the glacier popping, to pay attention to the water melting. And he's putting that explicitly in tension with the time scale of the political discussions that are going on in the assembly halls. And he's really inviting us to think about both the deep time of those particles, the speed of water melting, the speed of political decision making. So there are many, many others, and I'm sure all of you here will have your own examples. I suppose what I'm concerned about when we think about a pedagogy of temporal imagination is how we move between these. Right? So the futures field has sat in its own field for a really long time, and it sits in its own community. And then you've got the people working with pedagogies of temporal suspension that, these are not talking to each other. What it feels to me we need, if we think about the temporal imagination, is that it is a meta-reflective practice. So it is not just about imagining time in certain ways, it's about becoming reflective on the limits of each of these modes, of any mode of thinking with time, and it's about seeking to go beyond them. And here I draw on Steer and Kirstingsworth on imagination in education, and they talk about meta-imagination, this ability to become reflexive about how you're using your imagination. They say, develops from the breakdown and subsequent recognition of conflicting reference systems to highlight the distinction between simply imagining something and reflecting on and responding to the limitations of that first instance with the purposeful introduction of new imaginings. So in each of these 5 instances, for example, not only do we develop kind of capabilities and tools for becoming sensitive to different conceptions of time within each one of them, but we also recognize that in and of itself is insufficient. In and of itself, it's one way of thinking about time, and we need to be in dialogue with others. So really what I want to suggest, and what I'm making the case for in this paper, is for the development of an interdisciplinary community of practice that might be able to come together to share insights and practice in temporal pedagogy across these different fields, across future studies, critical time studies, decolonial theory, indigenous pedagogy, environmental and adult education, rhythm analysis, and I should also add in there arts and social arts, participatory social movement practices. I want to suggest that it might be helpful for us to start thinking about how we create cross-curriculum programs of study for primary and secondary education and also for adult education, although my hunch is this is foundational stuff and we need to do it young. I want to suggest that we need a sustained program of research into these temporal pedagogies. Actually, many of these are very poorly documented. We don't know that much about the consequences of these sorts of activities. And then I think we need to be developing useful theoretical frameworks that allow us to grapple with all the different ontological and epistemological, sociological, psychological, educational questions that all of these raise for us. So to me, this is a research agenda that, and it's one of the reasons I'm delighted to be invited to speak as part of this series, is to see how this connects with all of you and with the work that you're doing. And I just want to bring this back to this question of why this matters in a warming world. I have to share this image. I saw this image at COP26, and it was just, to me, the best description of what we're doing. A deflating world being pumped up desperately by somebody with an electric power supply, and the limits of that as a way forward. When we look at the world that we're living within, it brings with it a huge invitation to think about the urgency of what's going on. So one temporal lens really invites us to think with urgency about the imminent collapse of a particular form of human civilization, and also the ongoing collapse and loss of many, many, many different species, ways of being, and in the world. Thinking with a warming world is also inviting us to explore alternative futures, to think about how we deal with our relationships with troubled pasts, how we live with the disruptive rhythms that these changes might bring, and how we engender disruptive rhythms ourselves. A warming world is inviting us to think about how we coordinate. You know, that key function of time is coordination, synchronization. How do we coordinate ourselves as individuals and societies in collaboration with the more than human temporalities of carbon molecules and ocean currents? Living in a warming world is also demanding an ethical engagement and confrontation with responsibilities to future generations. So the current political temporalities that we're living in, the time of the clock, and the language of time as scarcity and threat, I'd like to suggest is serving us very poorly in these conditions. I'm clearly not the first person to say this. There's some brilliant writers, Michelle Bastian, Bill McKibben, and others have talked about the climate crisis as one, if you like, a crisis in learning how to tell the time. So all of this matters. So for me, all of this brings me to the sense that we need all the imaginative intelligence we can gather to see the situation we're living in all of its temporal complexity, and to notice the sorts of possibilities that might emerge if we're able to reframe our perception of what's going on. And the educational task under these conditions is far from trivial. So I spend a lot of my time talking to people about education and climate change, and the key question is often, how do we tell kids about what's going on with climate change? That to me is not what our educational job is right now. Our educational job, one of them, is to help us let go of the naturalized, habituated and embodied concepts of time that have served us so poorly to date, and figure out how we open up the possibility for a richer temporal imagination, which will involve an ethic of listening and inquiry, more attuned to the multiple and contested times in which we're living. And I think it's only that sort of more sensitized ethical attunement to the diversity of time frames and rhythms that are at play in this situation that we stand a chance of finding new ways of coordinating ourselves. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening. And I think I'll stop there. That's the link to the project that we're working on that's just been launched.